What determined the standard of beauty to be thin? Seems like something that has always existed, but where did it originate? My name is Rain Parcell. This is episode 1 of my series, Starving for Acceptance, Why Fashion Keeps Selling Us the Same Body. This is the origins of the thin ideal, history of beauty standards, as part of my senior capstone, with my primary research question being, why does the fashion industry continue to promote damaging beauty ideals despite growing awareness of their harm? So that is the overarching theme of my video essays. My goal is to create increased awareness of this harm, create a community to discuss these issues, and to begin to change that ideal. To note, my videos and research are centered in a female and a Western perspective, as that is my experience. This video serves to answer what are beauty standards, where did they come from, how did they change, and primarily, where did the obsession with thinness begin? In order to answer these questions, I want to start with a quick overview of a timeline and then go more in depth following this. So, today we are going to look at the Paleolithic era, beauty standards in the Paleolithic era, the ancient Egyptian era, ancient Greece, ancient Roman, then massive time jump to the Renaissance era, the Victorian era, the Gibson era, the 1920s, the 1950s, 1960s and 70s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and the 2010s. And at the end, I'll cover 2020s, modern day, a little bit now, but it will also be mentioned throughout the whole thing. Starting in the Paleolithic era, so think cavemen, nomadic hunter-gatherer times, there's not much evidence to what the standard was at the time, but as an example of body ideals, we do have the Venus figurines, which are very famous, and the most famous being the Venus of Willendorf. Their purpose, although not precisely determined, is believed to have been fertility idols, mother goddesses, or symbols of health and obesity in times of food scarcity. As we can see, they clearly emphasize fertility and weight because of the importance of reproduction and survival at the time. The more weight you had, you were more likely to survive cold, harsh winters, whatever. That was the standard of the Paleolithic era. Now, moving on to ancient Egypt, there was a typical standard of youthful slenderness and heavily athletic body types for both men and women. The Egyptians were very uniform and rigid in their ideal bodies, and it didn't differ between gender, class, anything at all. However, weight itself did not influence the build that they strived for. You were allowed to be whatever weight was healthy for you, but there was an emphasis on athleticism. In contrast, ancient Greece had very different standards for men and women, with men expected to be extremely athletic, which actually in modern day, I feel like it's still true. Male diet culture and body ideals are heavily driven by gym culture. But ancient Greek women were expected to be soft, rounded, and emphasize fertility again. Women were admired for being plumper and fuller as it signified wealth and stability. Ancient Rome doesn't differ very much from ancient Greece, with the expectation for women to be fuller, curvy, and have pale skin. So, now, doing a giant time jump, because there's not much relative importance of the standard changing until the Renaissance era, where we have an ideal of pear-shaped bodies, softness, and still as a representation of fertility, but also in this era, a woman was just a representation of her husband. She wasn't really her own, she was more property of a man, so his wealth, his status, and his work were represented through her body. So, how much money he made directly impacted how much food he could put on the table. So, more money you made, more food on the table, your wife had more weight. And that was representation of his work. So it was like good to have more weight. But it also meant women did not have the autonomy over their own bodies because it was property of their husband. And in addition to the body ideals of the time, you have a rise in lead-based makeup in order to make yourself more attractive, which is absolutely awful, and continued until around the 1950s, where it became off the shelf. However, only in 2018 or 2019, I believe, did we start removing lead from hair dyes, like colored hair dyes. Following the Renaissance, we go to the Victorian era, which is where I personally denote a shift in standards to valuing thinness, and we continue on with that standard until now. So, the Victorian era emphasized a curvy body, full bust, but with a tiny waist, primarily due to the rise in the use of corsetry. So, corsets had existed in previous eras, of course, but they became dominant in the Victorian era as a representation of morals and social discipline. Corsets were a symbol of wealth, of status, etc. However, the manner in which they were worn is so extremely dangerous. On screen right now is a diagram of what Victorian corsetry would do to a woman's organs, which was published in 1908, just to depict the harshness of the standard. It was a form of oppression carrying on the idea that a woman was just a representation of her husband. The way corsets symbolize wealth is because it showed you were able to have your mobility restricted as you were rich enough to own servants. You didn't have to be able to bend over and clean something. You were just expected to sit still, look pretty, kind of. It shifted to becoming a status symbol to have the hourglass figure and straightened posture that came with a corset, or in general just began to be worn to avoid judgment of their natural body shape. Of course, as time goes on, corsets become more available regardless of class, which we still do now. We see celebrities wearing something and it begins to get copied. It gets made in cheaper versions and it becomes widely available to the public. However, prior to where it was widely available, we began to associate wealth with thinness, and we viewed fatness with poverty, and in turn we viewed fat as being lazy, because the rich were wealthy and thin, meaning that they worked hard for that, although obviously not true, as the wealthy often just exploited others for their work. So this view of fatness as poor and thinness as success continues to define the narrative now. As corsets fall out of popularity, there's a rise in diet culture as we search for other ways to thin our bodies to fit the standard that we set. So, following Victorian, we're going to the Gibson Girl era, which is from 1890s to the 1920s, and followed the standard of still thin but busty with an emphasis on an S-curve silhouette. The time period is named after the drawings of Charles Dana Gibson that, in ink, captured the new feminine ideal, centered around independence and beauty that's characterized by a tall slenderness, active lifestyle, and was essentially radicalization prior to the flapper era that came shortly after. In the 1920s, in a push for freedom for women, there's an emphasis on a boyish figure with a flat, boxy silhouette becoming popular, yet still increasingly thin. So, women were going out, being promiscuous, and are doing that by rejecting the emphasis on a full bust of the previous eras. The 1930s became more feminine and slim, while the 1940s shifted into the housewife era with an hourglass figure, but the real change to that standard was in the 50s with a full reverse of the Jazz Age. The 1950s is characterized with an extreme hourglass, thin waist, full bust as the body ideal. The societal standard for the feminine ideal at the time was primarily driven by the end of World War II, where when the men returned home from the military, they wanted to leave that life behind and settle down with a nice woman in a nice suburban neighborhood. So, the rise of the housewife. Marilyn Monroe was the biggest example of the standard for a 1950s body type with a defined hourglass figure. All of her clothes were made too small to give the illusion she was bursting at the seams, emphasize her hourglass figure, and solidify her role as a sex symbol. She is often considered plus size despite being a modern size 0/2. Also in the 1950s, prior to, across the world, there is standardized sizing amongst clothes where the smallest widely available size was an 8, which is now classified as a size 0, with a 23 to 25 inch waist. All clothing production followed these guidelines on size. However, companies began to realize that by recategorizing their clothing sizes, they can increase the profits as it is designed to make women feel better about themselves by being skinnier at their store. What is called vanity sizing, and it has made shopping virtually impossible. Now, while it started in the 1950s, it did not become mainstream until the 1990s, and was originally done with the purpose of accommodating slimmer fashions. However, it reinforced the standard of being thin. Now, by modern day, our sizing varies with a deviation of about 6 inches. So, you have 2 pairs of jeans labeled medium, and they can have a different waistband of 6 inches, which is a very dramatically different size. It removes clarity, creates shame, and some stores you'll be a different size, different jeans from the same store, you'll be a different size, different washes of the same jeans from the same store, and you'll be a different size. It makes us feel worse, makes us seem like the problem. So, if you have ever had the experience of trying something on, wondering why it's not fitting when it is your usual size, that's why. The fashion industry is purposefully making it harder for you to find clothes you will feel good in. In the 60s and 70s, as a counterculture to the strict, rigid housewife identity, the standards completely shift back to the 1920s body with a thin, boxy frailness. There's a rise in hippie culture, and a lot of the 60s standard is defined by Twiggy, with a slender and youthful build. The standard continued into the 70s with this rail-thin look and a massive change in fashion with punk, hippie, and disco culture on the rise. Everything was about fun, it was about going out, it was about the youth, which also meant slenderness. As we move into the 80s, there is a slight shift from just thinness to a more lean and toned body driven by workout culture, the bodybuilding craze, and the prevalence of women in the workplace where they want to be seen as powerful. The standard can be represented by Jane Fonda in her top-selling workout videos. The body became more of a representation of strength both physically and mentally. While Weight Watchers and other forms of diet culture originally existed in the 50s, there's a sharp rise in dieting in the 80s with lower fat, increased protein, and excess in carbohydrates. In the 90s, we begin to promote extreme thinness, often called the waif or heroin chic. The movement was led by models like Kate Moss or Naomi Campbell, and I find in this era, drug culture was heavily tied in with the standards being set, with the rejection of the perfectionism of the 80s with the glam and the health, with a transition to extreme dieting culture that promoted a rise in the use of weight loss pills and drugs to obtain a similar body. The 2000 standard is the same as the 90s, as the extreme thinness became more and more reinforced in media, in paparazzi, and in fashion. Styles of the 2000s focused on crop tops, extreme low-rise jeans, and overall very tight and showing a lot of skin clothing. The 2000s is also known for harsh commentary in the media about body size, whether it be Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie or Britney Spears. As these standards grew more harsh, the difference in bodies we saw also became minimized. Now, the body shift The body standard shift in the 2010s is dramatic, with an emphasis on fit and curvy bodies with accentuated breasts and butts, popularized by the introduction of social media and influencers, primarily the Kardashians. The emphasis on specific body parts led to so much gross over-sexualization on social media at the time, and that became the standard for young girls, which is so dangerous and so unhealthy. And there was an increase in promotion of cosmetic procedures such as BBLs, Botox, lip filler, liposuction, whatever, which is just creating a fully unattainable and unrealistic standard for the masses. We wanted a tiny waist with a very full bust, similar to the standards of the Victorian age, but now we have a new way to get that, but it is not remotely realistic for what people look like. Now, in the 2020s, modern day, I think we truly have a combination of these standards, but all with one thing in common: thinness, mainly of the waist and the stomach, although in fashion, I do think we are starting to trend to the intense thinness similar to the 90s. Ultimately, what is reinforcing this obsession with thinness is the patriarchy, the massive shift in the Victorian era where women were property of their husbands, and that continues until now. Parts of the standard changed, but thinness as a priority has not. It needs to. It isn't healthy, it isn't realistic, and the standard is so damaging and so deeply ingrained societally, and there is absolutely no reason it needs to be the standard. Personally, I think a lot of people are more accepting around stuff like body positivity, where you don't care what other people look like. You don't think of them any less of a person. But there is such an internal standard where even if you don't think of a person any differently based on their weight, you still think, oh, I want to be thin because I don't find myself to be enough by being who I am. I'm not seen as pretty enough. I'm not seen as worth it, valuable. And if everyone thinks to themselves like that, it keeps the standard reinforced, not at the fault of individual people, but as a system. And there is so much stigma and shame around discussing one's weight, how one feels about it, and it can be seen as strange or shameful to simply love yourself how you are, to not find something that needs to be fixed about you. Like, it's strange to view yourself positively. And none of that is okay. That's the point of my series. Breaking down the standard, analyzing where it came from, what is reinforcing this, and getting rid of the stigma surrounding body ideals. My goal with this video was to go through the history of beauty standards, show the changes, and pinpoint where an obsession with thinness began in order to create increased awareness and community around this issue. So, if the ideas and content I shared resonated with you, please keep following, watch my other videos, feel free to contact me by email or Instagram, both will be down below. Thank you so much for watching and giving your time to me.